18-year-old Sidney Daniels was a trainee third-class steward on board the ill-fated Titanic. He managed to survive the sinking, jumping overboard at the very last minute. And in her book, author Jean Legg charts the story of her father's life from when he went to sea, aged 14, until he passed away, aged 89. Sidney was Titanic's last hand, the last surviving crew member, and we're here to talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Titanic Legacy, a podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with interesting and inspirational people who continue to keep the ship of dreams legacy not just alive but thriving through their creative work. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I am honored to bring you a conversation with the author of Titanic's Last Hand, Sidney Daniels, his life story, which is available online at Harlequin Press. This is the daughter of Sidney Daniels, Titanic's last surviving steward. Please join me in welcoming Jean Legg. Oh, big round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor to speak with you today. I've had the opportunity to talk to so many family members of Titanic staples, Robert Hitchens, Molly Brown, so many people we've heard stories about, but this is the first time we've had on the show a daughter of a Titanic survivor, a child of a Titanic survivor. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I love connecting with people all around the world doing this show. And where in the world are you joining us from?
From the UK, from Great Britain.
Very good. Have you lived there your whole life?
I have, yes. I live down in the south of the UK, right on the coast, right near the sea.
Very good. Get that fresh sea air. Now, one of the first questions I always ask family members is, as any Titanic enthusiast knows, survivors or people who perished, their families either talked about it right away and told their story right away or kept it hush for a while. When did you first start hearing stories about your father being on the Titanic?
He was one of those that talked very little about it. But I first heard it. I was born just before the Second World War. So for the first few years of my life, it was only war. That's all I knew. And I first heard about it just vaguely when I was probably about 7 or 8. And I heard it mentioned, but to me it was a story. And it didn't really interest me, so I didn't take much notice. But I heard more about it by the time I got to about 9 or 10. And I realised then it wasn't a story. My father had actually been on that ship. And so I took a bit more interest at that time.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction that your book is available online at the Harlequin Press website. It's not on Amazon or widely distributed. That's where you have to go if you want to get your hands on it. But you can,
yes.
Even if you're in America like me, you just have to send an email and say, hey, could you please ship this book to me because I want to get my hands on it. What inspired you to write the book?
It took me a long time to decide, but I kept thinking he had such an interesting life, such an amazing life. Not only on the Titanic, but on other occasions. And after he died, I thought I wanted to record it. I'd never written a book before. It's the only book I've ever written. And I just thought that his history and his story, unless I record it, will just be lost. And I just felt the need to write about his life. And the more I researched into it, because he spoke very little about his experience, the more I researched, the more interesting it was, and the more I wanted to write.
I can attest to the fact that it is interesting, for sure. It is honestly a page turner, as the lingo goes when you're reading books. Every turn of the page brings a new adventure, it seems like, which is his life. And what a blessing to have you to record that for his legacy and Titanic's legacy. But today we kids, we take advantage of our phones, and we're taking pictures of everything, we're taking videos of everything. But for people in that time, so much is lost if it's not recorded, written down. And if you had not written this book, it's tragic to imagine all of the information and the stories of his life that may have been lost.
Yeah.
How much did your family contribute to putting this together?
Um, by encouragement more than anything, because they when I said I was going to write it, they all said yes, good for you. But really, none of us knew a great deal from my dad what he went through, because he spoke so little about it. But there were little things that one or the other of my siblings would tell me. But to be honest, because I was the youngest, I think I probably heard more, because by the time I came along, my father, the memory had faded more, and my father could speak a little more about it than he could when my older brothers and sisters were young. So in a way, I gained from being the youngest, and I learned a little more. But to be honest, most of the book was research after he died, because in later years he did make a few interviews with newspapers, a couple of magazines, and I have got here with me his actual words in one of the magazines that he actually said, which makes quite interesting reading, actually.
Did you want to read that for us, or are you just mentioning that you have it there?
I'm happy to read it if it's possible.
We'd love to hear it.
It's at the time that he realised that all the lifeboats had gone, and there were no lifeboats left. He had, with his with other crew, his penknife had freed the collapsible B lifeboat that slid into the water upside down with nobody on it. And he then knew that he had to do something for himself. So these were his actual words from there and then on. He said, when I later returned to my lifeboat station, the lifeboat had been lowered. Now, he'd been to various cabins to tell people to go up on deck. So he said, I saw no panic. I walked around towards the bridge and saw the water coming up the companionway pretty quickly. I could feel no motion from the ship, but saw that she had listed well to port and was down at the head. At that point, I realised I had to do something quickly to survive. All the lifeboats had been lowered. There was one collapsible lifeboat lashed to the side, and crew were trying to free it. And someone shouted, has anyone got a knife? And I shouted back, I have, and handed up my penknife. And the boat was cut free. It fell upside down onto the deck, which was awash, and the boat floated over the rail and away with no one on it. I knew I had to do something for myself. The water was well up the deck, and the ship listing and her stern coming up fast, and I was knee-deep in water, and an officer shouted, jump, lad, there's nothing left here for you. I climbed onto the taffrail. I held onto the boat davit and prepared to jump into the water. It was icy cold and black, and I had to be really determined to swim away into the darkness, away from the liner's lights. But I knew the suction would pull me down if I stayed close. I swam and looked back once. Titanic's stern was almost vertical, and that was a sight I never forgot. I swam, and at one point my hat came off of my head and floated away, and I remember thinking, I won't need that again. I came upon a lifebuoy with a man clinging to it, and I said, you need to swim away from the suction. But he didn't answer. Maybe he didn't speak English or was just too cold to swim. After a while, I came across bits of wreckage, and then a dark shape loomed, and it was the capsized lifeboat, the one my knife had cut free. I was exhausted by now and feeling very weak, but I managed to haul myself up onto the bow of the boat, almost the only space, as there were about 24 others, both crew and passengers, all clinging together, all men. It was bitterly cold, and by morning another man who had been huddled beside me died from exposure. During the night, someone on the boat began cursing. But someone said, "This is no time to curse, we should pray." And we all prayed together in a mixture of languages, but all with the same meaning. We said the Lord's Prayer too. I think I should have died because I wanted to slip away and sleep. But another man, a passenger, wouldn't let me. He said, "If you sleep now, son, it will be your last." We just hung on, waiting for the dawn, freezing cold. And as dawn came nearer, the cries of others away in the darkness grew less and less. And I think they probably drowned. Those cries stayed with me for years and years. At one point in the night, a man swam up to a half-done boat, wanting to climb aboard, but there was no room. And he realized this and said, "God bless you." And he swam away. I feel he must have perished. People have asked if the band stayed on the Titanic playing. I did hear them playing, but I can't remember any of the tunes. So that was his words when he was interviewed.
Incredible. Firsthand from Collapsible B, and any Titanic enthusiasts may know Collapsible B is the overturned one that Lightoller was on, Chief Baker Charles Jochen, Jack Thayer, and your father, Sidney Daniels.
Yeah.
The tale of the gentleman saying "God bless you" is it's something that just gives me goosebumps every time I hear it. Like someone
Me too. Me
face
too.
face to face with your fate and just wishing others well.
Yeah.
Incredible. Um, I don't, I want people to pick up this book because it is fascinating, not only just from a Titanic standpoint, but what struck me as I was reading it was like his Titanic story ends like halfway through. And then the second half of the book is just as fascinating as the first for anybody reading because his life was so remarkable. One thing that struck me was, he goes through the Titanic, he survives it, he goes home, he's on the boat, the ship back the next day. He didn't get looped into the inquiries, and he's back to work or headed back to the UK the next day, and from there he meets the love of his life, or his first wife, gets married, goes to war, survives a crazy attack in World War I, gets sent home, and then loses his wife, and then he turns 25. Like that, just that whole part of it seems like such an epic story, and then you realize, oh, he's still a young man.
Yeah.
And then the rest of his life is just as fascinating as the first half. He worked most of his life on the Olympic. Can you tell us
Yes.
about that?
Yeah. Yeah. He loved the Olympic. He used to call it his ship. And he was on her maiden voyage, and he was also on the last passenger journey that she made before she went to. She was actually recommissioned in the war for taking troops, but he travelled on the last passenger journey too. And when she finally went to be broken up, he was very upset because he said, "That's my ship." Yeah, yeah,
Can you imagine you're on the maiden voyage, and then
yeah,
you're on the final voyage,
yeah.
and
He,
this
he
ship.
be, sorry.
Go ahead.
He became first class steward eventually, and he, with two other stewards, was selected to serve the Duke of Windsor, the king that abdicated, when he travelled on the Olympics. So he felt quite honoured, for for his time on the ship.
Can't imagine this. You spend so many days, so many hours, so many years on a floating fortress, and then to see it sent off to the scrapyard to
That's
get
right.
taken
Yeah,
apart.
yeah. But what amazes me is that he travelled on the Olympic that went the same journey that Titanic was destined to take. How must that have felt? Perhaps after a few journeys, he got used to it. But the first journey must have been, I can't imagine, it must have been really strange.
And for anybody listening that is unfamiliar, the Olympic is one of Titanic's two sister ships that was constructed just before Titanic, and did a lot. They had a lot of the exact same design elements, and Titanic was only slightly larger than the Olympic, but they were basically twins.
They were, yes. The reason that she was larger was because she had the um, Cafe Parisien built, which made her heavier. Therefore, she was then the largest ship when she was um, did her maiden voyage. But virtually they were identical, as you said, twins. Yeah, yeah,
Mm. And even after working on the Olympic, he still continued to work in a shipyard, just always near the sea.
absolutely. Yeah, he couldn't leave the sea. I think he probably swam or learnt to swim before he could walk. He was always, very keen on the water. Yes, yeah,
And that's
yeah,
another thing too, when he in the passage you read too, when it can, if just imagining swimming in that water and getting so tired, what hypothermia does, and I love how you describe in the book what kept him going.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, his mother had died a year before, and before he actually did took the jump, he said, I could see, it was a starry night, no moon, it was a starry night. He said, I could see one star that looked brighter than the rest. And he thought, that's my mum. She'll look out for me. And I think that gave him the courage to jump. And he kept that not in his sight, but he kept that in his mind all the time. She's looking out for me. Um, also, he had a letter in his pocket. Now, the letter had been sent to him when he was in Ireland. It had been sent from his dad, wishing him a good journey on Titanic. And it was in his uniform pocket. And when he was rescued onto the Carpathia, when they dried out his uniform and returned to him, that letter was in his pocket. And he, without realizing it, that little bit of home had been with him throughout the whole of that night. We still have that letter. We still have the original letter. It's going into a museum, but some of it can still be read, and it's very water stained.
That's incredible. And just to imagine, you make it to New York safely after surviving the Titanic disaster, and then you're on another ship headed right back through the same ice field.
Yes.
Ugh, it's one thing that fascinates me is we grow up with these stories, and you see it in film, you read it in books, but it's an actual thing that people lived through and carried with them. We talk about I'm on the peer support team at my work, and we talk about trauma a lot and how that shapes you.
Yeah.
And having been through that, I can't imagine. I With my other podcast, I talk to survivors of an active shooter situation, and they described surviving that as kind of almost a rebirth. Like who they were before that is gone, and they're a new version of themselves, but they still have to mourn who
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
And
My,
go ahead.
my was World War One, and then he had quite a major accident when he was working the dockyard. He survived that, and he said, "I'm just a lucky man." So he carried that with him throughout his whole life. He was always very upbeat about everything. He was happy that he survived these things.
Your reception broke up a little bit, but what we caught up with was that he was working on a shipyard and he survived a fall.
Yes, yeah,
And as people read the book, you'll see he survived so many things. And so you mentioned his mother died just before, not long before the Titanic disaster.
yeah,
I think he had a guardian angel.
yeah, yeah. I think he probably felt the same. She was watching over him. Yes, yeah. I think you're right.
Now, I mentioned that his first wife passed before he was 25. So he meets the second love of his life, Kathy, who they marry and have quite a family, don't they? How many siblings do you have?
Well, there's six siblings, and so there are seven of us. Sadly, there's only two of us left.
Hmm.
But yeah, seven of us, and I was the youngest.
I always am fascinated by people who, work when work takes them away from home and they have to be away from their family so much. You mentioned he basically lived on the Olympic. What are your earliest memories of him?
Well, to be honest, he was at home when I was born because he left the sea at the beginning of World War II. So I was just a young child then. So to be honest, I never knew him going to sea and home and way at home. And it was just not. Um, I think my mother did an amazing job because there were a lot of us.
Yeah,
Uh,
that is a big job raising seven kids. I
She had a lot of us, oftentimes on her own.
yeah, I can't imagine raising seven kids with my wife in the house, let alone gone off. Um, what do
Where
you?
did he put them all? Because we only had a three-bedroom house. It wasn't a big house.
Wow. How was he? What are your memories of him? How was he?
Um, he was always a very upbeat person. He always looked on the good side sort of thing. Um, my mother used to play the piano and he used to sing, so he was like music. Um, he was very, very, very much a family man. And of course, when I came along, they were older parents. So we used to go, out on trips, etc. But we never went away on holiday. They'd done that with the older children, and I think, of course, after the war, things were so different. Um, but he was very seldom was he down. He was a man that loved the family, loved being at home, and just got on with life.
I love that. And you mention in the book he was invited to the premiere of A Night to Remember, and the newspaper came over and took pictures of he and your mom before they left.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
that was one of the things that really prompted him to come out of the Titanic shell and tell his story more, right?
absolutely. He had to be persuaded to actually go to the studios because when he heard it was A Night to Remember, the name of the film, he said, it's not. He said, it's a night that I want to forget. But then it was pointed out that survivors would make more truer film. So he did go on set. And actually, it was quite a cathartic time for him because he met other survivors who had gone through the same similar experience, and that helped him to speak about it. And that was probably one of the first things that prompted him to unload what was hidden, in his mind for years.
You also mentioned toward the end that he was contacted well, a couple of episodes ago, I actually talked to the historian of the Titanic Historical Society, which was previously Titanic Enthusiasts of America. Don Lynch was on the show having a chat with me, but he was contacted by the founder, Ed Commuta, at one point.
Yes, he was. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but yes, he was. He was contacted by them, and he was sent a couple of copies, which we still have, of the commutator. Yes, yeah,
It just ties everything together. This historical society is still around, still producing the commutator every 4 times a year. It's online now, but
oh really, all right,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and
because yeah, he was an honorary member of the society. Yeah, Mr. Kamuda, was that his name?
yeah, Ed Commuta.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, again, for anybody out there who is listening to this, I know you're listening to it because you're a Titanic enthusiast. You got to pick this up. Titanic's Last Hand. Sidney Daniels is the story of Jean's father. Looking back on the book, what would you say was the biggest discovery or impact for you?
Oh wow, a lot of things. Um, I think the biggest thing was when he ever spoke of it. When I was a young person, he always kept it upbeat. He didn't ever um, dwell on the downside, if you like. It was always, yeah, like, we got to America from the Carpathia. Oh, sorry, I've lost you. Oh, we got to America on the Carpathia, and I just spent a night at the Seaman's Mission. But to be honest, since writing that book, I've found out another little piece of research that I didn't know about. He actually spent 3 days in hospital when he got to New York being treated for exposure.
Hmm.
And he never ever mentioned that. He only said, I got to New York, spent a day in the mission, and came back. So everything was a surprise that I found little things that happened to him that he never ever had mentioned. So I think that's what surprised me the most. And the more I researched, the more I found out, and the more I thought, wow, what a man. Yeah.
Yeah, it is an incredible and fascinating true story. And what a blessing for your family that you have put this together for generations to come. We were chatting right before we started recording here, but you have several grandchildren?
I have 10 grandchildren. I have six great grandchildren with three more due, and one are twins. So yeah, we're still keeping going. All the family, it's getting bigger and bigger. Yeah. One thing I didn't mention, and I had he actually saw the Titanic go down, and he actually voiced exactly what he saw, which I found really interesting because there's been a lot of theories. People have said it didn't break, etc. But he said I actually saw it go down. Um, so there's, as I say, I tried a bit of a detective. I found out so much, and I learned more of the man that I didn't really know. He was dad, but after he died, and I researched, I thought, what a man, as I said just now. Yeah, yeah.
Anyone who Googles Titanic, Sidney Daniels will find pictures. One is of him pointing at a sepia toned picture of Titanic saying, "This is where I jumped off from." And when you hear the stories of people jumping off Titanic, I mean, the James Cameron's movie came out when I was in high school. And so my memory of, seeing it visually go down is everybody clinging to the highest point where they possibly can. But if you dig into books and you read survivor quotes, you see so many instances of people deciding, I'm going to jump off and see if I can make it in the water. And when you see him pointing at the picture, it's like halfway down the ship, and you think, well, why didn't you keep going up? And I think in the moment, a lot of people just figure, well, it's all going to be down eventually. Like, why
Yeah,
am
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
extending the time? But
yeah, uh,
and reading the book and reading your account just puts you in his shoes, just thinking, all the thoughts going through his head and at
yeah,
that moment when he makes that decision.
yeah. That's the one time he did say it was scary because he had to really make himself jump. He said the lights on the Titanic seemed more of a draw to stay because the cold, icy water was not a very attractive thing to do. But yeah, he that picture, that was another thing that helped him to talk about it. It came around the same time that the Night to Remember film, so the two together helped him to break the where it was hidden in his head to actually mention it. Um, and I think it helped him a lot. That picture stayed in the house for years and years. It was just always on the wall. Yeah,
Where is it now?
it's it was with my brother. my eldest brother, and it's now with his widow. Yeah.
Another treasure out there in the world. Well, I want to thank you so much, not just for writing the book, but for joining me today to tell the story. We're gonna, reach so many other people who may not have ever heard of him or heard his story and keep it going. That's why I started this podcast, was to keep Titanic's legacy alive. As they may not have had cell phone cameras back then. We have to preserve as much as we can, straight from as close to the source as we can get. And as I mentioned at the top, I've never had a son or daughter of a survivor here to have a conversation with us, and I know it's getting late there, and I appreciate your time so much. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the opportunity. I do appreciate it. As you know, I considered it for a time, but it's so nice that it can be recorded. Just for he wasn't the only one. He was no hero, but just to record what it must have been like for people to actually jump, the fear of the suction pulling them down, being on that upturned lifeboat with no oars, so it just floated wherever. So many things. They were destined to survive, those people on there. And as you say, there were others that, also were fortunate. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Can I just add one thing? We have here in the UK, if we have somebody who is someone special, say a poet, a writer, a star or something, we have what we call a blue plaque scheme. And where they lived, they put a blue plaque up. And I've just been told today that there will be a blue plaque put up in Portsmouth on a house where my father lived, which is rather nice to know. And that's quite a special honour. So it's quite nice. Yeah.
That's amazing. And for anybody out there, find this book, Titanic's Last Hand, at Harlequin Press. Just search for it. Last Hand, Sidney Daniels, his life story by Jean Legg, who we have had the absolute pleasure of getting to know here on this episode of Titanic Legacy. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to rate, review, follow on your favorite podcast platform. I want to say thank you one more time to our lovely guest, Jean Legg.
Thank you, Paul. My pleasure for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your father and your family's story. Thanks to everyone out there for tuning in, spending your time with us here, and keep these memories alive, keep the legacy alive and thriving. Until the next episode, ladies and gentlemen, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make each day count.